According to President Trump yesterday, we may be nearing the end game on the Russia-Ukraine war. He said that within potentially 3 days, he's going to finally lay out his plan for how the Russia-Ukraine war is going to come to an end. And based on all the things we've seen up to this point and what other members of this whole theater are saying out loud, I think that probably we're going to get to the point to where he's going to say, our plan is to walk, because there's not much of an option for any other jointly agreed upon plan. And to try to make sense of a lot of the different moving parts here and what a lot of different people are saying, we have the ever amazing Colonel Douglas Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, highly decorated combat veteran and definite friend of the show. Doug, as always, welcome back.
Yeah, I think you ought to drop the use of the phrase "make sense" and just say "try to explain," because it's impossible to make sense of most of what's happening.
Fair point. I do stand corrected, and we will proceed accordingly. I want to show first of all something from Putin, who made a rather surprising to some. A lot of people are focusing on this in the West. They say that Russia is finally willing to talk to the Ukraine side. They've actually said this for quite some time, but let me show you exactly what he did say in context of talking about the Easter peace deal that the Easter ceasefire that Russia emplaced.
Потому что мы относимся к любым мирным инициативам положительно. Надеемся, что также к этому будут относиться и представители киевского режима. Хотя мы видели первичную реакцию, я думаю, что это все заметили, было опубликовано заявление, согласно которому наше предложение рассматривалось как игра судьбами, жизнями людей и так далее. Но там, видимо, нашлись кто-то поумнее, кто подсказал, скорее всего, эти иностранные кураторы, что отвергать такие инициативы – это проигрышная позиция для киевского режима, и они быстро согласились.
A couple of important things there. Number one, he said he did not say that he would be willing to talk to Zelensky or the president of Ukraine. He said representatives of the Kiev regime. So that's number one. The second thing is that he talked about how the whole Easter ceasefire came into existence at all, not because the Kiev regime, as he calls them, came to that agreement, but because the Western curators, in his view, actually compelled them to agree with it. Let's look at the second part of that first. Do you think that the only reason Ukraine agreed to Putin's lead on the Easter ceasefire was because the West, i.e. the United States, put pressure on him?
You know, I don't know, Dan, which is the easiest answer that I can come up with. I'm not party to the internal discussions. You know, the Ukrainians, whether or not they say so publicly, are reaching the end of their respective rope. They're going to have to make some decisions shortly for the reasons that you've already outlined. I think President Trump is going to announce his readiness to walk. And that puts them in a difficult position because the Europeans can't provide him with the cover and support that he needs. So it's hard to tell, but we're clearly nearing the end. Surely the Ukrainians are aware of the massive Russian troop and equipment buildup. I'm sure that's not lost on them. They know where that's headed. They can't stop it. So anything's possible, but I think President Putin is offering an opportunity to avoid total annihilation. I think that's what it boils down to, and that's really what he was saying.
Well, you say that surely they have to know, but I'm not sure that all of them on the Ukraine side seem to know. One in particular is the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, who said he's also willing to talk to Russia, but with some caveats.
Саме припинення вогню реальне, тривале, має стати першим кроком до надійного і тривалого миру. Представники України і на зустрічах в Парижі, які були, і на зустрічах в Лондоні цього тижня матимуть основне завдання, першочергове, саме щодо безумовного припинення вогню. Саме це має бути початком.
So his position is we're not looking to end the war. We're not looking for the terms of addressing the core causes. As Russia said, we're actually looking for first a complete and total and unconditional ceasefire, and then we can start talking about it. What say you?
I think that President Putin made it clear, as you noted, that he's willing to talk to representatives of the Kiev regime. I don't think that includes Zelensky. And I'd be surprised if Zelensky is with us in 60 days.
And wow, that's a pretty stark statement. What leads you to that conclusion, and what are the risks?
Because Zelensky has served his purpose to this point. From the standpoint of the West, he sacrificed, we think, 1.5 million Ukrainian lives on the battlefield. He has not much left to do. There's no way of stopping the Russians once they move west. Everybody knows that. The United States is losing patience, not that it ever had much to begin with. So what does that do for the group in Kiev? Well, if they want to live out the year, they've got to replace Zelensky. Replace means he's probably going to be expelled, punted, or mysteriously disappear. I don't see much future for the man at this stage.
Well, he doesn't seem to be tracking that, and he still is thinking that he's in charge. In fact, he added a little bit more on that same interview that he did right there, saying here's the terms he's looking for on his ceasefire.
Ввечері очікую нову доповідь головкома Сирського. Тобто Росія відкинула не лише американську пропозицію повного і безумовного припинення вогню, яка була зроблена ще на перемовинах в Джиді більш ніж місяць тому, але і вчорашню пропозицію. Пропозицію і надалі після Великого дня робити все для тиші. Все це ще раз демонструє, чого насправді хочуть в Москві. Тим не менше, Україна зберігає свою пропозицію не завдавати ударів щонайменше по цивільній інфраструктурі. Ми очікуємо чіткої відповіді з Москви.
See, he still is talking like he thinks he's in charge and he's on the dominant position, and he expects an answer from Moscow, and he wants this first ceasefire to include all civilian infrastructure as well. And that, by the way, he's using these rhetorical devices that all the problems here, they're all on the Russian side. That shows who's really after this. Now, that does play well in Western press, but it obviously is mocked and laughed at on the Russian side. Is there any value in him making these kinds of statements?
No, but he's in a position where he can say nothing else. If he suddenly changed his tune and announced a willingness to consider anything other than what he's always said, it would be death. It would be sort of dishonor before death. And I think he doesn't want to do that. And I don't think the people backing him would tolerate that. So I wouldn't pay a great deal of attention to it. The proverbial handwriting is on the wall, and the future is coming for him, and that's grim. I think he knows that. There's a reason his wife, a short time ago, tried to escape from Ukraine. She was found, arrested, and forcibly returned. She knows the game is up. The game is up, but he's not going to admit it. We're just going to wake up and discover he's gone. All these people, dictators, political figures, it doesn't matter. They all maintain the fiction until they can't. That's what he's doing.
And it's really odd because usually when he makes demands of Russia and says, they have to answer for this, it gets an eye roll at most. But in this very specific case, especially on the claim that we want to prevent civilian infrastructure from being used or being targeted, Putin actually did respond and said this.
As for the proposal not to strike civilian infrastructure targets, that needs to be looked into. Well, for example, everyone is well aware of the strike by our armed forces on the Congress Center, I believe, of Sumy University. Is that a civilian object or not? It's a civilian one. But an award ceremony was taking place there for those who committed crimes in the Kursk region, both units of the armed forces of Ukraine and nationalists. And these are the people we consider criminals, who must receive deserved retribution for what they did in the border area, including in the Kursk region. And they did receive that retribution. It was done precisely in order to punish them. Is that a civilian object or not? But the regime uses these civilian objects.
And he went on actually and provided several other examples showing clearly that, yes, we know that if you put military objects in civilian areas, we are going to attack them, whatever happens with that. And so they're not shy about admitting that straight up. But so obviously
there's nothing to admit. I mean, it's fact. And this has been going on almost from the beginning of the war. And the very opening months of the war, we began to see the Ukrainian forces position themselves in civilian infrastructure, malls, buildings that were commercial. They would put rockets, artillery, anti-tank weapons, and so forth there. And the Russians were ultimately left with no choice but ultimately to attack and destroy these people inside the civilian infrastructure. The difference is as follows. The Ukrainians have never given a damn about how much civilian infrastructure they destroyed in Russia. They don't give a damn about how many Russian men, women, or children are killed. The Russians have cared. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is perfect on the Russian side. There are always mistakes. You know that from personal experience. You open fire on something, and then you discover later, well, the enemy was there, but it happened to be sitting next to a building that might have contained civilians. In our case, fortunately, nothing happened. But we've seen this before. The difference is very clear and unambiguous. Go all the way back to Bucha and all of the terrible allegations against the Russians from day one. 90+% of these allegations were unfounded. On the other hand, Ukrainians have done terrible things to the Russian population. They were doing terrible things to the Russian population in Donetsk and Luhansk and eastern Ukraine, which is probably the single most important reason the Russians intervened there militarily to begin with, which was to stop it and to protect the Russian population. Of course, they had no idea, apparently, of just how far things had gone in Ukraine. They didn't know in detail about the biolabs that were trying to come up with genetic weapons that would kill large numbers of Eastern Slavs. They weren't aware that there were weapons being developed for use against the Russians that were calculated to kill large numbers of Russians. It's an entirely different set of circumstances. So I don't take anything the Ukrainians seriously, but I think what Mr. Putin is saying is very real, and he means it. The problem is I see no evidence that the Ukrainians will ever comply with any of that. In fact, the opposite is the case. I think they'll continue to do whatever they can to harm as many Russians as possible. And look, if you go back to people like Victoria Nuland and her crew and the people in Washington under Biden and prior to this that were there in 2014 and nursing and cultivating this hateful regime in Kiev, that's what they wanted. They wanted to harm Russians, which is why I urged President Trump, as soon as he was elected, to put an end to it and say, look, not my war, didn't start it, we don't want it, we're suspending all aid to this regime, I'm pulling everybody out within 48 to 72 hours. No more Americans in Ukraine. That's what he should have done. Had he done that, he would be sitting on top of the world at this point, and he would be well along in normalizing relations with Russia, which again is vitally strategic to us. We need to normalize relations with Moscow. That, of course, is the very opposite of what the people that brought on this war want. They want permanent conditions of hostility with Russia, just as these same people are advocates for permanent conditions of hostility with anyone Israel doesn't like. It's the same gang. They're all the same people.
It's really disappointing, I guess, that we seem to be going down the wrong path. And I think that Trump, I think that he fancied that, no, I can come up with a deal instead of just walking and just making all these things by sheer force of personality and function with the withdrawal of the United States and it collapsing this whole thing down. I think he fancied that, no, I can come up with a deal that will convince the Ukraine side to agree to this, and then we can do it in order. I suspect that that's what he thought. I think now then he's recognizing that it's not because he doesn't have a legitimate partner in Zelensky who actually wants the war to end, but wants to preserve the status quo irrespective of all facts and whatever else. But when you look at what Putin said about a month ago, it's clear that this is something that the Russian side has said in almost from the beginning, and it's definitely not changed, but it shows just how different the two positions about what people are trying to accomplish are?
We agree with the propositions to stop hostilities, but we proceed from the fact that such ceasefire should be such that would lead to a permanent peace and remove the initial, original causes of the crisis.
And so if he's trying to find something that gets to the end or gets to the core of the reason why the war started, which you referred to just a second ago, and all we're looking to do, and all Zelensky's looking to do, rather, is he just wants to stop the attack on civilian infrastructure, not even address the core causes, then you see you have an unbridgeable gap.
Well, President Trump tends to view the world through the lens of quote unquote deal making. This is not about deal making. This is about the life and death of nations and peoples. There's no interest in some sort of short-fused deal that is going to elevate him or his administration to greatness. There will be no win for Donald Trump personally in any of this. That was never going to be the case. The only win that he could achieve was to extricate us from this and put the regime in Kiev in a position where it had to reach an agreement with Russia. And that is ultimately what has to happen for any kind of stability and peace to emerge. Now, let's be frank, there's no such thing as a permanent peace in Europe or anywhere else. You can achieve some sort of stability, conditions for stability and prosperity, at least for a limited period of time. And that's what the great statesmen of the past, whether they were Asian and China or Japanese or Russian or British or French, everyone sought to create conditions of stability, knowing full well that there was no permanent solution, but that you could achieve some stable outcome that would last for perhaps decades. And in the meantime, having achieved that, you might be able to work on the remaining issues that could come up in the future and find a way forward past those obstacles. In other words, perfection is the enemy of good enough, but good enough is not a deal. Good enough means everyone has looked at their interests and everyone understands everyone else's interests, and we put together the best possible solution that takes, hopefully, everyone's interests into account, fully recognizing that no one involved is ever going to get everything they want. And I think Mr. Putin knows that, but he's dealing with Zelensky, who has no incentive to do that. He has every incentive to stall, every incentive to spoil opportunities for any resolution, because resolution will lead to his immediate demise. He will be through. He has no future once he enters into a peace agreement. Everybody talks about Netanyahu being totally self-serving and wanting war because peace is the enemy of his future. Well, that may be true, but in this man's case, Zelensky, that's also true. He is not interested in any sort of arrangement whatsoever, because once he reaches it, he's through, because he's never going to get everything that the people that back him want him to get. It's impossible. Now,
I suspect that President Trump is now aware of that. I think that they see that Zelensky the fact that after some of these declarations that the U.S. desire to move down a certain path, to have a ceasefire, to have an energy ceasefire, not a Red Sea, but a Black Sea deal, to whatever, none of which ever transpired, because then instead of doing those, you had the Zelensky side literally throwing the president, the vice president, and Witkoff multiple times under the rhetorical bus, clearly indicating he's not willing to move on his position. So I think that with Trump saying within 3 days he's going to have some kind of announce his deal, I think probably means that he's getting to we're going to cut you off point. So the question I got to you, first of all, as Zelensky mentioned a minute ago, he's going to have, or else his representatives are going to have meetings in London, I think starting tomorrow. And then according to what Gary showed up there from Russian media is reporting that Witkoff is going to be in Moscow sometime after that. So it appears that the sequencing is, and from what I can understand in reading the tea leaves, we're going to issue something close to an ultimatum to the European and Ukraine side in London, and then whatever comes of that, Witkoff is going to go to Putin and say whatever they're going to say. What do you expect to happen in each of those three cases?
Nothing good. Frankly, the Europeans can do nothing without us militarily. That's simply a fact. So the first thing that has to happen for any sort of arrangement with Moscow is that we need to end any further military aid or support to this criminal regime in Kiev. We need to understand what kind of society and state we're dealing with in Ukraine. Remember, this is arguably one of the most corrupt, maybe the most corrupt countries in the world. Now, that's not something that the Ukrainian people necessarily embraced. It's something that happened to them in the aftermath of the destruction of the Soviet Union, and they've never really recovered from it. This is not going to work. In other words, you go and meet with the Europeans and say, we're going to say X, what do you think? They're going to oppose you. Well, that's fine. You've got to understand where you stand vis-a-vis the Europeans. I would argue that President Trump's position vis-a-vis Europe today is similar to President Eisenhower's position vis-a-vis the British, the French, and the Israelis in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. He needs to turn around and say, that's it. We're out. We will not support any more action against Russia under any circumstances. We are going to normalize our relations. We strongly urge you to do the same. And if you don't want to do that, that's your affair, but bear in mind, this is where we're going. Now, that makes sense. If that's part of his deal, then that's fine. But if he goes to Moscow and says, well, we want to do a deal with you, which is nonsensical language, frankly, but we can't because we can't just walk away. And I'm afraid that that's the kind of thing that will trap the president. He should never have allowed himself to be trapped into this to begin with. He is right. This is not his doing. This is not something he wanted. So there was no reason to jump on this bear trap, which is what he's done. He's got to get out of it. Now, we're not going to get out of it and look as good or strong or capable as we would have had he done this back in January. But the position is still there. He can still get out, which is what he needs to do.
Doug, one of the things that may help him get there is, ironically, what may happen in Europe during these talks here, potentially tomorrow. You mentioned a minute ago that what's in the strategic interest of the United States is to get back to a normalized situation with Russia for all the reasons you've mentioned. We could go into more if you want. But who's not on board with that? Ironically, it's not Zelensky, it's NATO.
Well, there will be no normalization of relations with Russia when the war is over. That will not happen. That will take decades because there is a total lack of confidence. The threat is still there. As I said in my speech, even if the war comes to a conclusion, the Russian threat is still there. They are building a war economy. They are spending so much money on defense. They are producing in 3 months an ammunition what the whole of the alliance is producing in a year. We are ramping up our ammunition production. Luckily, we have to. There's no way that we can normalize relations with Russia after the war is over.
So what does he think? And actually, this is a question for you. What do you think is the message that Russia hears when he says that kind of thing, and what will be their reaction?
Well, first of all, Secretary General Rutte needs to summon all the Dutch, Belgian, German, and French forces available, take stock of it, and begin this 10 to 20-year program that's designed to create the high-tech equivalent of a Maginot Line between Western Europe or Europe in general and Russia. See how that goes. I think he's delusional to the point of absurdity. The populations have recognized, all you have to do is look at the polling data, particularly in the two countries that I consider to be the most important, frankly, from this standpoint, are the Germans and the Poles. And those populations have made it abundantly clear they don't want a war with Russia. What this man is promising is a condition of permanent hostility on the European continent towards Russia. He's a lunatic. There's no chance of that happening. He's going to be gone here shortly in the next few years. New people are going to take over and say, what planet is this man on? This is not 1900. This is not 1945. This is not 1980. We live in a different world today. The world is much smaller. The consequences of military confrontation are far more serious, and you're dealing with a very different Russian state from anything we've ever seen. It is certainly not Soviet-like in any way, shape, or form. It is somewhat more czarist in many ways, but Russia itself is very focused on building prosperity, improving living standards, ending these conflicts, getting along with its neighbors. This is not a state that one has to prepare to fight in perpetuity. So it's just nonsensical. He'll be gone. All these people are going to be swept away. There's no future for this globalist nonsense of which he is very much a part.
And what about the Russian reaction to this? It seems to me that if you are talking about, like you just mentioned there and drew that whole picture about all these places that need to start this ramping up, you have Ursula von der Leyen already talking about this $800 billion European buildup, et cetera. I mean, it seems to me that that's going to cause Russia to say, well, we have to take your word, so we're going to continue to build up our forces afterwards, except they're starting from here and we're starting from somewhere under my table.
I think von der Leyen and the rest of these people are completely out of touch with financial and economic reality. Germany's being systematically deindustrialized and I would say almost fatally harmed by her own governments, thanks to their globalist colleagues. So I don't see that anything is going to happen in the near term remotely like what they're advocating right now. They're very much like Zelensky. They're going to be making these same ridiculous comments when they're removed from power. It's only a matter of time until these people are swept away. It's coming. Everybody says, well, how do you know that? Well, we have several hundred years of European history that teach us that lunatics like this eventually are removed. It takes time. It took 5 years to go from some semblance of order to complete chaos in France after 1789. But then eventually what happened? It ended. All of those people were removed and they moved down a different road. This is going to happen all over Europe. So I wouldn't worry terribly about Mark Rutte, who seems to think he is in command of some great military power that's ready to march at a moment's notice. And there's something else here. Remember, everybody should go back and read the speech that President Putin gave to the industrialists, the economists inside his own country. It was a very good speech because he talked about the future. And he made it very clear that Russia's future is with BRICS. He said Europe is gone for the moment. Maybe they'll come back, but at this point, we're moving on. We are focusing to the east and to the south. That's where our economic future lies. Does that sound like someone who's getting ready to invade Europe? Hell no. He's not remotely interested in it. But he's essentially saying these people are unbalanced in their thinking and behavior. So for the moment, it's pointless to discuss any sort of future economic or financial, let alone political arrangements with them. They're incapable. That's a very good speech. Everybody should read it. And that will explain where Russia is now headed. So frankly, Rutte is like King Lear raging at the storm. He's irrelevant.
Yeah, and I think that's I think once people get a chance to find out what actually does happen and all these fear-mongering things don't materialize after this war is brought to an end, and after, I hope, President Trump does indeed make good on his threat and walks at the end of this week, that would be fantastic. It'll cause all kinds of near-term chaos, but then when things settle down, as you mentioned, it took 5 years in the French situation. Probably won't take that long this time, because I think that Europe is not going to be ready to throw a bunch of more money into a dead hole. I think that they'll come to a grip, and we'll see that things actually settle down and the war can actually stop. That's certainly the way I hope it works out. But, I guess we'll wait and see on that.
The thing that's so striking is this tremendous failure of imagination in the West.
Yeah.
There's just no imagination anymore. There's no thinking about the reality. They're not looking at the world as it is. They see an illusion. They cling to it and refuse to give it up. They're going to go down hard, very, very hard. And the sooner they go down, the better for everybody, because no one is interested in a major war on the European continent with Russia. Only a lunatic would be interested in that. And the Russians aren't interested in it. That's what people don't get.
Yeah. And of course, they don't want to get it on the West because we've painted him as the evil Hitler-like figure. So, but anyway, that's I think all going to be exposed. Speaking speaking of exposed, in the last bit of time we have here, I want to talk about another issue that's more centralized in the United States, which has to do with the Department of Defense and its leader, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, and where we're going. Now, of course, since I think it was the 21st of March, there's been all kinds of, crazy stuff going on in the news about this SignalGate. We're on this Signal chat. You had the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, et cetera. A number of other people were working on an operation that had been going into Yemen, and it's a bombing campaign that was going on, et cetera, and all this stuff because the Atlantic Journal author was accidentally put on there by Mike Waltz, et cetera. Well, that has kind of unleashed this big storm, which continues to perpetuate, and it's been added to in recent days by events inside the senior bubble of Hegseth himself. Now, one of the big things that happened here recently was that 3 members of his inner circle were fired after being allegedly under investigation for leaks, which is kind of ironic because the original leak happened when the National Security Advisor actually put a reporter on there. And then subsequently, what was reported after that was not a leak. But a lot of turmoil about and unclarity about what actually led to their firing. But Hegseth now is going out really on an offensive to throw these guys under the bus. And this morning, or actually yesterday, President Trump was asked, where is Hegseth with you right now?
Ask the Houthis how much there's function there. There's none. Pete's doing a great job. Everybody's happy with him. We have the highest recruitment numbers I think they've had in 28 years. No, he's doing a great job. It's just fake news. They just bring up stories. I guess it sounds like disgruntled employees. You know, he was put there to get rid of a lot of bad people, and that's what he's doing. So you don't always have friends when you do that.
Okay, I want to focus on that last part. He said, I brought him in to get rid of a lot of bad people. These people were the ones that Hegseth brought in. These were the ones who were supposed to help him find the bad people. And he got rid of his own and now is calling them disgruntled employees. What's your view overall of just this chaos going on at the top of the Defense Department?
When President Trump makes those kinds of statements, it suggests to me there's great confusion in his mind as well as everyone else's inside the administration. Let's step back a minute and look at the strategic reality. What we need to do in the Department of Defense is not unleash new bombing campaigns anywhere in the world, not commit more naval power, not add more ground force to Eastern Europe or anywhere else. We need to look at the reality financially that demands we cut the national defense budget by 50%. And what are we talking about now? We had Hegseth that sent out a silly tweet. Oh, we're going to have $1 trillion. Well, good luck with that, because where we're headed, I don't think that has any chance of happening. And people inside the Washington bubble are delusional. They don't seem to understand just how fragile our economy is. We've seen $8 trillion of wealth destroyed since President Trump took office. Again, what should have happened to begin with? He should have said, we're going to have to retrench. We're going to have to shed these commitments overseas. We have to focus our attention here at home. These are the things that President Trump could have said that would have made him an heroic figure in the history of the country. It would have upset people in Washington, but he would have won enormous support and praise across the country. But he didn't do that. So where does this man Hegseth come from? This is a Fox News talking head who essentially endeared himself to the Trump regime and the current administration by announcing that he is a quote-unquote Christian Zionist. Go back, dig up the film, Gary can find it, and look at the discussion that was held in the conference room of the Secretary of Defense, right across, it's not immediately across, but almost across from the Secretary's office in the Pentagon, and ask him to play it. And it shows on one side of the long table, Hegseth and his quote-unquote team. And on the other side is Mr. Netanyahu and his team. And Hegseth opens the meeting by saying, you can see from the team that's around me that we're ready to do whatever Israel needs. We are here for you, and we are prepared to do whatever is required. We're on your team. Okay. Well, that was the critical requirement for anybody to join the administration, whether it's defense or state or anywhere else. That's what you're seeing right here. And you want to broadcast the discussion and what he says. What happened? Well, suddenly Hegseth brings in some other 30-somethings. I'm sure they're nice people. I don't know how much depth they've got, how much experience or understanding. We haven't seen much of that in the last two administrations. Maybe they were very, able people, but eventually they all sat around and told Hegseth, this deal about Israel and war with Iran, that's scary. Yeah, no kidding. We don't know where it's going to go. We have no way to control it. Once we unleash it, how do we contain it? And I think Hegseth and his friends all got cold feet. And then somewhere along the line, somebody in the media found out that Hegseth and Tulsi Gabbard and potentially Vice President J.D. Vance, another, ardent Israel first guy, all of them said, this Iran war, that may not be a good idea. Whoa, that's not what you were hired to do. Hegseth was hired to say, yes, sir, we're ready to go. We're all loaded. Give us the word. That's what he was hired to do. And he's not doing it. So we've fired everybody around him that works for him, ostensibly, not because of this signal chat. I mean, there's no question that was an exercise in stupidity and imprudence, but because of the Israeli connection. So his head's on the chopping block. How much longer he will be there is anybody's guess. And I know that President Trump has done this before. He said these kinds of things about Steve Bannon before Steve Bannon, boom, was suddenly out of the White House almost overnight without explanation. And it's happened with other people. So I wouldn't put much stock in the public statements at this point.
Yeah, I remember Rex Tillerson was in that same boat, how he was supported until all of a sudden he wasn't. So
yeah.
We'll see with that. But, honestly, Doug, what's not going to help Hegseth avoid that fate is statements he made on Fox News this morning.
If you remember when this all started, the first go-around, because this is the second go-around, right? They peddle old stuff, they kick it back up. I said repeatedly, no one's texting war plans. You know why I said that? Because I'm in the bowels of the Pentagon every single day. Just 10 minutes ago, I was looking at actual war plans of things that were ongoing or pending things to happen, because that's on a regular basis on classified systems. That's my job for the war fighters, for the President of the United States. I look at war plans every single day. What was shared over Signal, then and now, however you characterize it, was informal, unclassified coordinations for media coordination and other things. That's what I've said from the beginning.
Oh, man. And Gary, if you could put that full screen up there, this is what was for media coordination, unclass and informal. F-18's launch strike package, trigger-based F-18 strike window starts now. More F-18s launch, strike drones on target, second strike starts, etc. Those is as blatant black and white classified information as you can possibly get. And yet he is continuing to claim that it's just minor stuff and no big deal at all.
On more than one occasion, President Trump has told people, whatever you do, don't hire anyone who is smarter than you. President Trump is being successful. And Hegseth is clearly not very smart. And that may be part of the problem. The notion that this sort of thing would be treated in a cavalier fashion is frightening. I remember when Deputy Secretary of Defense Deutsch was removed because he brought a classified information on his laptop computer home to his residence, ostensibly to work. And when that was finally discovered, even though he was a card-carrying insider with the Clinton crowd, he was removed. He was fired. There's no question about, is this right or wrong? And should any action be taken? Obviously. But I think that, we have to understand that President Trump's selection reflects this view. Don't hire somebody who's going to second guess you. Don't hire someone who comes in with any imagination and offers alternative viewpoints. He just wanted somebody to go over there and do what he was told. And when the time came to launch the war against Iran. Now, people are saying, well, President Trump doesn't want the war. I believe that. The problem is he's not doing anything to stop it. And there is no evidence at this point, and I hope I'm wrong, but there's no evidence that what comes out of the discussion on Saturday between the Iranians and us will necessarily lead to an agreement. And what people fail to understand is if you're sitting in Iran, you're listening to what sounds like a throwback to the GCPOA, only this time with a very laser-like focus on, quote unquote, the nuclear weapon. You ask, where's the evidence that anybody in Washington can be trusted? Where's the evidence that some other president or even this president in another few months or in another year may decide to throw this overboard? Again, you're back to the problem that the Russians have with us. The Chinese have it with us right now economically, and have said so in a very straightforward manner to President Trump. Everyone is interested in stability. Everyone is interested in knowing that if we say something, that we can be relied upon to do it. Not something stupid, but something intelligent. Right now, there is no confidence in us at all, anywhere. And I don't say that with any sense of satisfaction, because I sure as hell did not support the last bunch, and I had hoped for something better this time around, but I'm not seeing it. And that's why it's so important to go back to that conference that was held in the Secretary's office, in his conference room with Netanyahu. That's why it's important to listen carefully to the things that President Trump has said on more than one occasion, and understand that everyone right now is very skeptical. So I don't know what we can expect to happen on Saturday. I don't know what President Trump can expect to happen, but he's made it very clear that if he doesn't get what he thinks is the right deal, he'll go to war.
Well, I'm going to show just one more element here that is going to further erode that level of potential for trust, because I think that there is people are watching this for more than just the evidence that's at play with the SignalGate stuff and all that and the firing of these people, because it gets to the character and the nature. So just imagine if you're the Iranian delegation and you're wondering if you can trust whatever's going to come out of Saturday. When you see the Secretary of Defense, first of all, Gary, I don't want to play this. I'll just talk it and then play the second part. But Hegseth also yesterday said that the people that he fired were because that they were disgruntled employees, that they're under investigation, and this investigation revealed that they've been releasing some information. But then on Tucker Carlson, Dan Caldwell, who, by the way, was in that clip that Gary showed a second ago on that February the 5th deal with Netanyahu, he was in the room with that as a trusted aide of Hegseth. Now here's how Hegseth treated him, and what he claimed was he was fired for cause.
So I just want to be totally direct with you. Did you leak classified information against the wishes of your superiors to media outlets?
Absolutely not.
Did you photograph classified material and then text pictures of that material to an NBC News reporter?
Absolutely not, and I have not spoken to an NBC reporter while at the Pentagon.
Do you know what you've been accused of?
No, I don't. Sitting here right now, myself and Darren Selnick and Colin Carroll, the other two individuals that were escorted out of the Pentagon, initially placed on leave and then fired on Friday, we have not been told as of this recording, one, is there what we were being investigated for? Two, is there still an investigation? And three, was there even a real investigation? Because there's a lot of evidence that there is not a real investigation.
But we can know some things just by the details. So here are a couple. Have you been polygraphed?
No. I've never been hooked up to a polygraph machine since I've been in the Department of Defense.
Okay. Have you given up your private communications devices, your private phone, your phone?
No.
To anybody?
No.
Okay. So that raises the obvious question. I'm trying not to use the F word here because the lying is just driving me insane. You're being accused of leaking classified information, but the people accusing you would have no way of knowing whether you did that or not because they haven't polygraphed you or taken your devices, your private devices, correct?
I mean, there are...
You can't even make the allegation because there's no conceivable way you could prove that.
So you see, Hegseth in front of God and country is saying these guys were under investigation. It proved this and that, and we took this action. And then yet you didn't even take his phone. So how can we believe anything that Hegseth says going forward, especially something about war and peace?
Well, the sad part is that Hegseth has decided that he wants to stay and is going to fight desperately to keep the job. I think that's very clear. There doesn't seem to be any sense of loyalty to any of these subordinates that came in with him. He's loyal to his own survival.
Yeah.
He is no less at risk of being removed than the people that he's already sent on their way for ostensibly making similar comments about perhaps the war with Israel or war with Iran is not a good idea. And later on, Dan Caldwell, in that interview, makes it clear. He says, I think this is simply because there's a bipartisan consensus on the Hill that they want a war with Iran on behalf of Israel. And I said, no, that's not a good idea. And so I and others who have, essentially said something similar have been removed. That's all. And now that's not to downplay the seriousness of, these stupid actions on Signal or anywhere else. I mean, that's just childish nonsense. And I remember when I was the director of the Joint Operations Center at the beginning of the Kosovo air campaign, somebody, I think from the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or something, I can't remember the man's name, called me and said, well, what's in the first strike package? I said, what? I'm not going to tell you that. What kind of nonsense is this? Don't call again. Click, and I hung up. You're always going to have people in the media who could care less about the United States, its security, don't give a damn about soldiers, sailors, airmen, or Marines. They want a story, and they'll do anything they can to get it. Now, I believe Caldwell. I don't think he had anything to do with that. Now, has anybody else in the building? Who knows? There's always someone somewhere that will talk. But the problem is it's hard to make a story work unless you can get it from near the top. And so that's the problem. But I think in this case, it's just the Israel connection. That's all.
And I want to ask that question here because there's an uncomfortable question that needs to be addressed. Now, you're not on the inside, so you're not going to know anything, but I'm guessing that you can give an educated guess as to this. You mentioned loyalty. So Dan Caldwell had been with Hegseth and had been associated with him for quite a number of years. I think 7 or 8 or 9, maybe even a decade. And so he was brought in there. He was a trusted aide. He was loyal to the administration. He was loyal to the country. He was loyal to Hegseth. Hegseth then threw him under the bus. Whatever was going on, if it was really about the Iran situation, the question is, who has the heft to convince Hegseth to get rid of one of his most senior and trusted aides? It wasn't the president, apparently. I don't think Trump would have even cared about that kind of stuff. But who outside of the Secretary of Defense, the number 2 guy in the chain of command, to compel him to get rid of somebody he himself brought in?
Well, now you're asking the question of who or of whom behind the curtain is running the show.
That's why I said it's an uncomfortable question, but one that needs to be addressed.
But you've got to look at the people that ran the personnel selection system. And the last time I looked, when they put together the names of people that were being selected to hold key posts, certainly Mr. Lutnick was one of the key players. In fact, I remember him giving an interview in which he told everyone that no one knows more about personnel selection than I do, and then boasted how he had hired 1,500 or 1,000 or more people in the aftermath of 9/11. And, so he's got this under control. Then the interviewing reporter said, well, is anybody advising you? And he said, well, I'm getting a lot of help from Jared Kushner. So I think you start there. Who are the people that had a hand in selecting these people and putting them where they were? Now, if we go back to Hegseth, frankly, under the circumstances, and again, I don't know what Hegseth really thinks. He's obviously put a lot of distance between himself and the people on his staff who urged caution with regard to attacking Iran. So, I mean, he's put a lot of distance there. Is this something that he thought about carefully and was inclined to agree with them? Suddenly discovered, well, the people that put me here say I'm not going to be here long if that's my position. And so did he decide then to rid himself of these troublesome people that had made the mistake of urging caution or inaction regarding Iran? We don't know. You know, if he in fact took the position that Mr. President, I'm uncomfortable with the current plans for an attack on Iran. If that's something that he took, then he should resign. You go in as the Secretary of Defense, and this is a matter of war or no war. This is not a small matter. We have to understand that. We're not talking, James Webb, when he was Secretary of the Navy, went in and told President Reagan, he'd done this a few times, and he said, well, we're not going to have I promised 550 ships. We're not going to have that many, so I have to resign because I'm not fulfilling that pledge. He'd be in a lot of trouble, and so Weinberger told me, they said, good, go away, you're out. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about war or no war. This is very serious stuff. So is Hegseth telling us that he's on board 100% with war against Iran? And always has been. And all of these people that he brought in with him who had the temerity to suggest that perhaps that's not a good idea, he had to grudgingly remove. Is that what happened? Or are we now dealing with someone who desperately wants to stay in the job, will say anything and do anything to keep it? I can't pass judgment on it. I don't know. I think President Trump, he needs to think this one through very carefully, but I don't think he will. I think what he said is what you heard, but he should be very concerned about who's running the Department of Defense.
In just the last few minutes that we have on here, I think that the chances are pretty high that Trump is going to pull the string on Hegseth and replace him. I honestly, you just can't imagine this going on because there's too much collateral damage for Trump himself. In the event that happens, is there anybody, like 2 or 3 guys even, that you can see anywhere on the horizon that could pass muster through this personnel process that could be a decent alternative?
Well, first of all, you're asking me who could pass muster through this personnel process, and I assume that's the current one inside the Trump administration, correct?
Right.
Well, then you need an Israel firster, someone who is committed unambiguously to war with Iran, who, if appointed to that position, will wholeheartedly execute that operation. And the first person that springs to mind is Senator Tom Cotton. Senator Cotton is from Arkansas.
Yeah.
The governor of Arkansas can appoint another Republican to take his place in the Senate. Senator Cotton has always looked favorably on the assignment as Secretary of Defense because he has aspirations to be president. And
he was considered earlier in the process after Trump was elected. His name was bandied about.
Now, the only danger, of course, from the standpoint of President Trump is that he may think this man's smarter than he is. I don't know. But he certainly is absolutely 100% in support of Israel, the Israel first approach and agenda, and war with Iran. So if that's what President Trump is promised to do, and that's what he believes should be done, then that's somebody I would expect to see show up. And again, remember, Dan Caldwell talked about the bipartisan consensus on the Hill that supports war with Iran. So I would imagine under those circumstances, he would be as easily appointed as Secretary of Defense as Rubio was as Secretary of State. They're very much the same.
Well, that's the most scary prospect that I've ever heard. In that case, maybe we do need to keep Hegseth. He's not quite as on board as because I actually will show this afternoon again a recent comment by Cotton on that very topic, and he is a war luster. You can't even say a warmonger. He's a war luster for Iran specifically. So that would be a really bad thing for the United States and the possibility of having peace anywhere. But we'll have to wait and see. That's just all speculation on my part right now. Who knows whether Hegseth is going to keep his job or not, or what happens next. But we really appreciate you coming on like always and giving us this great insights.
Okay. Thanks, Dan.
And appreciate you guys too. And as I mentioned there this afternoon, we're going to have Dan DePetris, one of my fellows at Defense Priority, one of my colleagues there, is going to talk about, is Trump on the brink of war with Iran, this very topic, or is he near a historic peace? Because it seems like there's the possibility for both. We'll see how this issue plays into that. But if you want to get the details on where this is heading, tune in today at 2 p.m. on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.